Operating the U-boat was the most dangerous job in the German Navy. A staggering 40,000 men boarded, but only 7,000 returned to tell their stories.
The leaders of the boat, they pick their people. That you get on with the fellows, there's no fights or anything like that, we all have our habits and so on.
It was a marvel of technology, packed with deadly torpedoes, nearly wiping out the British Navy. But each mission was considered suicide, and by the end of the war, this iron coffin had a casualty rate of nearly 75%. Others suggest it could be closer to 90%.
The Battle of the Atlantic continues. As our convoys pass to and fro, U-boats lurk in the vast waters preparing to cut our lifelines at every opportunity. In a recent instance, it was a case of the biter bit.
Yet the question remains, why did nearly 90% of U-boat operators know that waving to family from the port was perhaps their final goodbye? The German U-boat wasn't just a novel concept when the Second World War erupted, it actually saw combat during the First World War, where Germany nearly starved the British Isles by sinking supply ships, yet they still lost a whopping 199 during the 4 years of war. By the time Adolf Hitler took over in 1933, the U-boats changed. Steel alloy and welding were preferred over riveting, creating a stronger hull that could allow it to dive deeper than anything else the world had ever seen. Diesel engines also became more powerful, improving speed when on the surface, while saddle tanks were installed to increase range. This new U-boat was something no one had seen, and it was going to prove vital in the early days of the war. But one lingering problem couldn't be overlooked, and that was the crew. Following the First World War, the Germans needed more crew for the U-boats, but pickings were slim, so the Third Reich came up with a plan. They increased the pay, improved training, and added benefits that would be extremely attractive for young Germans following the recession of the 1930s. So young men signed up in their thousands, each seeing the opportunity to earn a few extra bucks, but little did they know what was about to come.
With a ringside seat on one of our destroyers was an amateur cameraman who secured short flashes of the U-boats in the thick of the trouble they asked for.
In the early days of the war, the U-boat was unrivaled. The use of the infamous wolf pack tactic became something feared by every convoy, even if they were simply transporting supplies. It helped control the oceans, kept the British at bay, and gave German ships the early advantage in the war. In fact, reports suggest that for every U-boat that went down, about a dozen Allied cargo ships would meet the same fate. Yet, a glimpse on board would reveal that it was a completely different story. No glamour, no celebrations, just about 50 men sharing a single toilet, no showers, while living in these conditions for up to 60 days at a time. Now Hitler never cared. He was having success. More than 100 Allied vessels were at the bottom of the ocean, and Germany only lost 33 U-boats by 1940. These odds were definitely in favor of the Germans, and the tide of naval warfare slowly shifted to the Axis. As for the men on board, spoiled food and the stench of sweat became an everyday reality, and when the alarm sounded, everyone strapped in for a deep dive, a maneuver that made the U-boat virtually impossible to hit, but allowed escort vessels, all part of the Wolf Pack, to step in. This would become a tactic that frightened the Allies. A U-boat surfaced, fired torpedoes, then dove into the depths of the ocean as the rest of the vessels mopped up. If the battle raged on, these subs took strategic positions on the outskirts of the battle, using guerrilla tactics to destroy as many Allied vessels as possible. The Germans coined this Die glückliche Zeit, or the happy time, sinking as much as 8 million tonnage of Allied vessels in just a single year. It wasn't just about wreaking havoc, but a psychological warfare, creating fear that everything on the horizon could possibly be a U-boat. But back in 10 Downing Street, it was becoming a problem. The British needed a new way to take control, something that would rattle the Germans and make them reconsider whether the U-boat was still the dominant force of the ocean. As the war waged on, the British began losing control over the Atlantic, and German U-boats could pick and choose their targets, so the Allies came up with a plan. The first part of the plan was to increase the numbers. Instead of one vessel, merchant and supply ships were dispatched in groups of up to 60, with numerous escort vessels like destroyers interwoven. Two new specialized weapons, the squid and hedgehog, became vital pieces of weaponry, often deployed with depth charges that would capitalize on the slower speed of the U-boat, sinking them even after diving. But detection was still the biggest concern. So, the Allies used long-range aircraft, with one goal: to fly ahead of the ship convoy and scan the ocean for U-boats from above. Moreover, intelligence agencies banded together, decrypting the infamous German Enigma code, where they could now translate messages, finding the exact coordinates of these vessels.
Show the sinking of U-boats by RAF Coastal Command off Northern Ireland. With rockets and depth charges, Mosquitoes, Liberators, Sunderlands and Warwicks had quite a good time sending these relics of Hitler's navy to the bottom.
It became a battle of who would see the other first, and with the United States stepping in after Pearl Harbor, the tide of the war changed. While the German advantage was all but wiped out, the hunter essentially became the hunted, and casualties were about to spiral out of control in Berlin. As the Enigma code and all its secrets became widespread knowledge among Allied forces, the tide shifted, convoys were rerouted, and anti-submarine vessels were dispatched. The Allies know exactly where the U-boats were, what they were up to, and more importantly, how to take them down. It started with decoys, individual ships sailing close to reported U-boat positions, but not just as sitting ducks, drawing them out, while setting up ambush positions. They'd stick around the area, using the modern radar systems, while being notified whenever a U-boat surfaced. Aircraft scoured the oceans at night, picking up radar traces of U-boats and feeding this to destroyers, setting up an ambush. It became impossible to hide, and despite the Germans using radar-absorbing materials, it simply wasn't enough. Even the newer Type 21, better known as the Electra boat, couldn't make it to the battlefield in time. In fact, only 2 of these vessels ever set out on patrol. The Germans were losing U-boats at an astonishing pace, 43 in May 1943 and 244 for the year. Another 249 met their end in 1944, while 120 succumbed to the Allies in 1945. The onslaught became so bad that one U-boat operator remarked, "You hear the screws turning, hull moaning, water dripping, and you wait for either silence or death. When a depth charge hit nearby, the lights often went out, pipes burst, and equipment shattered. The crew whispered, barely breathing, hoping the enemy thought they were already dead. There were no lifeboats, no escape pods. If the submarine was breached at depth, you drowned. For most that went down, there were no survivors, no graves, just coordinates on a map." Yet the man in control was a tyrant, a man who didn't care about casualties, only results, and Hitler continued demanding more and more U-boats be built, each only to set sail and meet their end at the hands of the Allies. For the German mariners aboard, they knew that only a 10% chance of returning home was their reality. Many even wrote their final goodbyes before leaving, describing it as a slow funeral march to the Atlantic. But by the end of it all, almost 1,200 U-boats were deployed, with more than 780 lost. As for the crews, more than 40,000 men set sail, and only 7,000 returned home. 28,000 men lost their lives, while more than 5,000 became prisoners of war, a higher fatality rate than any other branch of the German military. All this destruction, conducted by one tyrant, and for what? There was no victory, no heroes, just a cold, dark, and lonely soul lost to the depths of the ocean.